Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to session 4 of this symposium. For those who doesn't know me, my name is Bruno Arpi, and I will be chairing this panel which focuses on the protection of the Antarctic environment by the Antarctic Treaty System, but also by other global regimes. Yeah, so we will talk about regime interaction, etc. Yeah, but the broad theme that we have for today, or the broad question is, are we doing well? But before we start with this discussion, I would like to thank Professor Shibata for organizing this fantastic event. Thank you, Professor. Okay, so let's start with this session. So today we have a very interesting panel that this session brings together a mix of interesting perspectives. Yeah, we have practitioners, scholars, international actors. So, and we will discuss two interrelated issues: how Antarctic governance is interacting with other global regimes, and how the ATS itself is adapting to rapid environmental and geopolitical change. Each speaker will have around 8 minutes for a short intervention, and then we will move into a Q&A session. To begin, we will start with Professor Karen Scott from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Karen will open the discussion by examining the implications of the 2025 ICJ, International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on Climate Change for Antarctic governance. Karen, the floor is yours.
Mike, please.
Okay, so thank you very much, Bruno. It's a pleasure to be on the second panel today. Yes, I'm going to focus my remarks on the implications of the ICJ Climate Change Advisory Opinion for Antarctic governance. And I think, or at least I hope, it'll speak to both themes of the session, global regime interactions and where Antarctic governance is doing well. And hopefully my remarks are reasonably timely in light of the UN General Assembly resolution adopted on Wednesday this week, endorsing the opinion. Now, we've had quite a lot of discussion today, which kind of confirms that Antarctica is inherently vulnerable to and consequential for climate change. But I think it's also worth noting that the Antarctic Treaty parties include states who historically bear a great responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions: the United States, the United Kingdom, states which have some of the highest emissions per capita, Australia, New Zealand, states which are currently responsible for very significant emissions, such as China, and the treaty's most recent exceeding state is Saudi Arabia, an important petrochemical state. As parties to the Antarctic Treaty, they are, and indeed all parties, purport to exercise a special responsibility for Antarctica, and they need to reconcile that responsibility with their policies and their action or inaction on climate change. This week, while a majority of Antarctic Treaty parties voted in favour of the United Nations General Assembly resolution welcoming the ICJ decision, a significant number of Antarctic Treaty parties voted against the resolution or abstained. Belarus, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US voted against. Argentina, Czechia, India, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, South Africa, and Turkey all abstained. So that's 11 of the 58 parties. So I think this does raise some interesting questions, and potentially difficult questions, for how the Antarctic Treaty System as a regime could and should engage with the decision, which is an authoritative statement of the extent, scope, and content of international obligations on states to address climate change. The court approached the interpretation of obligations across disparate regimes, from the UNFCCC to the Law of the Sea to human rights, as giving rise to a single set of compatible obligations. And this is where I see the opinion as having implications for the Antarctic Treaty System. That Antarctic Treaty System obligations relating to the mitigation of or adaptation to climate change should be interpreted in a manner that supports that single set of compatible obligations to address climate change. So this means that the ICJ opinion should inform the interpretation of Antarctic Treaty System obligations. And there are two sets of obligations I would like to briefly refer to for the purposes of my remarks. The Environmental Protocol's Article 3 obligations, which address the climate consequences of activities taking place within the Antarctic Treaty Area, and the broader, much more contested obligation under Article 2 to protect Antarctica and its dependent and associated ecosystems, which is not explicitly subject to any geographical constraint. Beginning with Article 3 and activities taking place within Antarctica, this is where I think Antarctic governance with respect to climate change is doing quite well, and it was great to hear about the workshop just a week or so ago. Article 3 is a due diligence obligation, and it would not be unreasonable to describe this as a stringent due diligence obligation, to use the language of the ICJ judgment. Within the ATCM, climate-related initiatives from 2009 onwards have not only supported the implementation of Article 3, but have more generally addressed climate science in Antarctica as well as adaptation. For example, parties must now mitigate emissions from Antarctic activities. The 2023 Helsinki Declaration on Climate Change notably calls on parties and non-state actors to move towards carbon zero in their Antarctic activities. Adaptation, of course, is a significant focus of the Climate Change Work Programme and the subsidiary group on climate change response. Perhaps the most important initiative supporting climate change mitigation in Antarctica is the ban on mineral activities other than for scientific research under Article 7 of the Protocol. Until 2023, however, no explicit connection was made between the minerals ban and climate change, although obviously keeping fossil fuels in the ground is an important mitigation strategy. The 2023 Helsinki Declaration for the first time made this connection, with paragraph 11 reaffirming the parties' commitment to Article 7, and that Antarctic mineral resource activities other than scientific research, including the extraction of fossil fuels, remains prohibited. Less positively, with respect to activities taking place in Antarctica, there's of course been a lack of progress in relation to the designation of emperor penguins, which we've talked about over the course of the last day or so, and indeed in relation to the management of krill. And in respect of the latter, we've actually had a regression in protection. Both species are highly vulnerable to climate change, and it's difficult to conclude that these management failures would constitute an exercise in stringent due diligence, or that all states are complying with their duty to cooperate with respect to climate change under customary international law. Moreover, we could undoubtedly go further than we have in terms of carbon neutrality of operations in the Antarctic. Important though the Helsinki Declaration was, it does not set out a timeline or a deadline for carbon neutrality. Why not? And should any tourist operator be doing business in the Antarctic if their operations are not currently carbon neutral? And why not go further and decide that now that we will never extract fossil fuels from Antarctica? In what future would Antarctic fossil fuel extraction ever be compatible with a stringent due diligence obligation to prevent climate change harm? The more challenging obligation for states, however, is the broader Article 2 commitment to the comprehensive protection of the Antarctic and dependent and associated ecosystems. This obligation arguably goes beyond the management of activities in Antarctica and could extend to activities outside of Antarctica. However, states have long taken the position that the protocol does not apply to external activities. I would suggest that this position is increasingly untenable in light of climate change, where the principal threat from state activity external to the Antarctic is the biggest threat to the Antarctic. It also undermines the idea that Antarctic Treaty parties have a special and privileged responsibility to manage Antarctica on behalf of humankind. I would suggest the ICJ advisory opinion supports a broader interpretation of Article 2. There have been recent tentative developments within the ATCM which have started to explicitly recognise the need for states to make emissions reductions in order to protect the Antarctic. So SCAR, in a number of papers recently, has made that connection. Both the 60th Declaration on the Antarctic Treaty adopted in 2021 and the Helsinki Declaration refer to goals of the Paris Agreement and highlight that the implementation of these Paris goals through a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is fundamental to protecting Antarctica. Neither, however, directly call on states to comply with their external commitments. I would argue that interpreting Article 2 of the protocol as applying to activities external to Antarctica that directly affects Antarctica and, by implication, the global environment, is not only consistent with the aims and objectives of the protocol and the Antarctic Treaty, but also with states' more general obligations to prevent climate harm and to cooperate under customary international law. This interpretation supports the ICJ's compatible single set of obligations on climate change approach. The advisory opinion further provides guidance on the steps that states should take to implement their climate obligations across global and regional instruments, including the Antarctic Treaty. Ultimately, treaty parties have to ask themselves, do they have the right policies and laws to meet their obligations to protect and preserve Antarctica and its dependent and associated ecosystems? Are they meeting the standard of stringent due diligence in their obligation to prevent harm? Are they complying with their obligation to cooperate in addressing climate change? And I think the lens of the ICJ advisory opinion could be helpful in answering those questions within the forum of the ATCM. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for that very interesting presentation. Thank you. And I was wondering when you were talking about this, to what extent the Antarctic Treaty System can regulate, or the ATCM can regulate activities that occur outside the Antarctic Treaty area, but actually have an impact in Antarctica. So from a legal point of view, Article 6, so we can talk about later in the Q&A. Thank you. So now we will move on to our next presenter, Nils Vanstappen, Legal and Policy Advisor at the Belgian Ministry for the Environment and co-convener of the joint CEP ATCM CAMLR Scientific Committee workshop. So Nils will discuss institutional interfaces within Antarctic governance, and in particular, how it will be possible to strengthen collaboration between the CEP, CAMLR, and the Scientific Committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bruno, and I'll try to hold the mic a bit further than I did the first time when everybody heard from my loud voice. First, let me start with a disclaimer. I have been to 5 CEP meetings and ATCM meetings. I've only been in an official capacity to 1 CAMLR meeting, so I don't have the same experience as some of the people around in the room here. But I have the experience of co-convening the joint CEP SC-CAMLR workshop, so I'm hoping that I can bring some relevant ideas to the table based on those outcomes. Also to say, I'm focusing here within the Antarctic Treaty System on collaboration between ATCM, CEP, and CAMLR, SC-CAMLR. But of course, there's other elements within the system which are of relevance, COMNAP, SCAR, and how they contribute to the whole system of environmental protection. Is something I'm not going into, but it's something to take into account. I want to start by picking up by a question I got from Professor Shibata yesterday, which is why? Why should we talk? Why should we worry about this? And I got a bit of time to further think about it, so I'll pick it up again. Of course, both bodies have different mandates, but they do have overlapping and quite similar objectives in a certain sense. Article 2 of the CAMLR Convention refers to conservation, including rational use. I'm not going to go into the whole discussion of what that means. And Article 2 of the Environmental Protocol refers to the comprehensive protection of the Antarctic environment and dependent and associated ecosystems. There's quite a bit of overlap in both objectives, both in content and in geographical territorial scope, but also in terms of approach. Both bodies, both the legal instruments that set the mandate for both bodies, plead for a holistic approach. In CAMLR, this is the ecosystem-based approach, but as I've just referred to, the objective in the protocol, there's also a focus on dependent and associated ecosystems. So there's this idea of having a holistic approach of the impacts and environmental protection. And just to add to that, the growing issue of cumulative impacts that from different activities managed by different parts of the system, which strengthen this need for a holistic approach. And just to pick up one thing, last year in CAMLR discussions on krill, references were made to the impact of tourism or the impact on tourist value, the value for tourist activities that krill fishing might have. So there's clearly an overlap in those mandates and those objectives. So what am I talking about? What is this collaboration about? I think it plays out on different levels. ATCM and CAMLR, the decision-making levels. CEP and SC-CAMLR, the advisory bodies, but also on the level of both secretariats, the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat and the CAMLR Secretariat. And just to signal that secretariats are already collaborating on a number of issues, and at the meeting they presented working paper 25, which I think is a good example of such collaboration. And I'll go further into that. So how should this collaboration be organized? And I'll try to focus on the outcomes of the joint workshop. But before doing that, I would just highlight some key differences also between both bodies and both regimes. I think in terms of, let me focus on CEP and SC-CAMLR. SC-CAMLR is a body very much focused on scientific advice, while the CEP focuses on a large range of advice coming from technical over scientific advice. And so there's a very different kind of, that leads to different representatives in the room. SC-CAMLR representatives are very much scientists. CEP representatives are sometimes scientists or people with a scientific background, sometimes environmental managers. Myself, I have a legal background, but I'm there as a Belgian National Competent Authority, so there's a different range of backgrounds in the CEP, which is much less evident in SC-CAMLR. There's very different methods and tools available. CAMLR has its own monitoring systems. CEP has had endless discussions on monitoring, but does not have its own monitoring systems and monitoring regimes. And there's also a different size and availability of financial resources for both secretariats. The Antarctic Treaty Secretariat has a staff of 9. CAMLR has about 3 times as much, as 26 in their secretariat. So just in terms of support, it's quite a different scope of the support that is available. But despite these differences, I think still collaboration is useful and valuable. And collaboration can center on 5 joint priority areas that have been identified in the 2009 joint workshop. So I'm talking now about the 2026 joint workshop. We've had 2 earlier joint workshops trying to find a way for CEP and SC-CAMLR to more efficiently and effectively collaborate. In 2009, the first joint workshop identified 5 joint priority areas. The first one being climate change and Antarctic marine environment. Second one being biodiversity and non-native species in the Antarctic marine environment. Thirdly, Antarctic species requiring special protection. Fourthly, spatial marine management and protected areas. And fifthly, ecosystem and environmental monitoring. Through discussions in both bodies, CEP and SC-CAMLR, in 2023, marine pollution was added to that list of 5 joint priorities as a 6th. And at this workshop, we've recommended adding a 7th one, cumulative human impacts, to that list of joint priority areas. So there's quite a bit of overlap there. There's quite a few aspects where joint collaboration is possible. And I'm just going to pick up on some of the recommendations from the joint workshop, and I'll take the paper here to see if I can properly look at them. And I'll go back to my what question. So collaboration is possible on different levels. Although this workshop focused on CEP, SC-CAMLR collaboration, I think a number of the recommendations that have been made are relevant for the other levels as well. So let me start with ATCM and CAMLR, so the decision-making level. The first 3 recommendations are very large and general recommendations. It's about, the first recommendation is about the space of the speed of decision-making, the pace of decision-making, keeping up with the speed of environmental change. The second one is about having a holistic approach to spatial management and protection of Antarctic systems. And the third one is about confirming the critical nature of long-term monitoring and making available sufficient funding to have long-term monitoring. These are relevant for CEP and SC-CAMLR, but are also very much relevant for ATCM and CAMLR to integrate in eventual decision-making. So I think those are 3 overarching ones which are relevant for that level as well. At the level of CEP and SC-CAMLR, there are a lot of recommendations which go much more in depth. I would just like to focus on a couple of them. One idea, and I think it's quite innovative, is to have a joint intersessional work stream on monitoring, trying to identify shared priorities, parameters and indicators, explore synergies on monitoring design, improve information sharing, and identify opportunities for improved coordination and collaboration. But there's also a recommendation that goes a bit further to establish a shared data repository or clearinghouse mechanism to support the storage, curation, access, and interpretation of relevant monitoring data. So those are quite far going, and just as far as I know, and maybe people with more experience in the system can tell me, quite innovative as well in terms of how we would practically collaborate between different bodies. And finally, on the level of the Secretariat, there's a very concrete suggestion that there's a very general request that both secretariats collaborate on operational topics of interest, including spatial data and information management. And just think the secretariats have begun collaborating on these issues, and I personally hope that they will continue to do so. So now I think I'm trying to round up. This challenge now will be trying to implement these recommendations, to move them forward, and to give some consideration to these issues. And that's it from me.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and I was wondering if you were going to mention the 2009 workshop, because our good friend and colleague Tony Press was at that workshop in 2009, so later he may give us some ideas about what happened there. And another interesting issue that you mentioned is that idea of collaboration between secretariats, and we have to keep in mind that both secretariats do not have their own legal personality. So to what extent are we informally amending the Antarctic Treaty System to give them more power to act for themselves? All right, I'm going to stop there. So let's move to our next speaker. And now it's time for Sonja, Dr. Sonja Dünnwald, Policy Officer and Legal Advisor in the International Law Section for the German Ministry for the Environment. She will discuss whether the CEP is an example for other international environmental negotiations. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for having me here on this panel. It's an honor. I think I will start my talk with a personal remark. When I say I'm going to the ATCM, I always say it's the nicest conference that I go to. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. It may be the organized breaks, it may be the food, it may be the community, and it also is the ending time every day. But there's also other factors that just make it a very nice meeting in comparison to other meetings. And I think I will focus my comparison here mainly on the negotiations for an international instrument, a binding legally instrument on the prevention of plastic pollution. So when I say I compare these, then it's obviously not a like-for-like comparison. We've heard yesterday from Ceicha that the CEP is a technical advisory committee that is to advise the political body that will then make the decisions. But I think it's also fair to argue from everything that we've heard today that it's still a negotiation, even in the CEP. And I would like to focus on a few aspects that I think just work really well and are really helpful for our work in the CEP. And the first, and we've already heard about it today, is the interaction between science and policy, so this interface. The ability for the CEP to ask for targeted advice on specific questions, I think, is vital for its work and how it is able to address issues. There is, and this is the experience from the plastic negotiations, there is a lot of science out there on a lot of things. For example, on plastic pollution, there is a lot of science that says how bad it is and how microplastics get into your body, but that still doesn't necessarily help you to understand how to draw up a treaty that addresses issue. It also doesn't look at elements that are relevant other than this part of science, like economic impacts, and all of that have to be considered to move forward. And I think here we can see, I mean, we don't have the economic impacts in the same way in the CEP, but we see that this ability to ask for targeted advice is really helpful to get what you want and to move you forward. I think this already starts when the committee is formulating the advice that it wants to have, because it means that all parties have to come together to understand what they really want when they ask for that. So I think this is a very important feature, and I would personally like to see that maybe attempted in other negotiations as well. Another aspect I want to focus on is the intersessional work. My experience from, I mean, of course, there are also intersessional work processes in established international negotiations like the CBD, like the climate change negotiations. There are bodies that work between the big sessions. But I think the difference that we have here that is very, very helpful is there's kind of always there's always something going on. There are ICGs, they can be more formal, there are informal ways to look at aspects. There is a forum in which targeted questions can be discussed. And I think this is really, really very good. And what is one element of that makes it very good is that it's not only a chair or one specific person driving the process, but it can be different countries driving the process. So it brings together not the opinion of one person who wants to go somewhere, or maybe two persons, because obviously in UN processes, many things are co-chaired, but it really makes everyone part of it, everyone who wants to be, and everyone can come with their own questions and ideas. And just to contrast that again with the experience in the plastics process, there have been many times in that process where that negotiating committee could not agree on what to do intersessionally, and then nothing was done. And then also the way that meetings are going, there is a new chair in the plastics agreement, and in the plastics negotiations, and I hope this will get better. There are video conferences where every party kind of states their opinions, and it's very difficult to kind of bring them together on specific points. And I think something like we have here, where you can just have in a forum ask specific questions and everybody who wants to contribute can contribute, is really something that can bring us forward. We've heard a lot today that that is not perfect here, and of course there are many things we can argue about, but I think there's also something very, very rewarding about the work of the CEP. I think the last thing I would just like to mention in passing is also the stakeholder engagement. I think ASOC works very well, giving targeted advice. In the UN process, of course, you might have a lot more interests, but I think it's not always super helpful to have, delegates bombarded with information and ideas from all areas of life, really. I think that it's really good to kind of bring it together in a concise way. And after the positive things that I said, I would just like to mention one challenge that has also become very obvious here today, and that's the question about the membership. I mean, obviously, the CEP has it easier because it has fewer members, and the ATCM has even fewer members, but we have also heard that it's obviously a problem of, accountability and, I think the term that was mentioned was it's a post-colonial construct, and I guess there is something to it, so we can't say it's all fair and square, but I think we can still also be happy in a way that it makes our life easier at this point, and we have to see how it goes. These are the discussions where we don't have to constantly talk about the common but differentiated responsibilities. And I think we had one glance, at least I felt like that when we were negotiating the Helsinki Declaration in 3 years ago, where you could see then all of a sudden all these interests come in and it gets even more difficult. I mean, arguably now it's even more difficult, but that's other political circumstances. Yeah, so I just think we can be happy for now with that, but we will not stay like that because obviously we need to open up to others as well. And I think with that, I'll just close. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting presentation. And also it was good that you remind us that the Antarctic Treaty System and the environmental protocol is still an example of environmental protection for other regimes. Probably Ceicha will come back to this point later, but that idea of, all right, we have a treaty that was negotiated in less than 2 years and has been able to, we'll say, relatively protect the Antarctic environment, but we will talk about that later, but thank you for that. Now we will move to our next speaker, Professor Catherine Iorns from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Catherine will examine Antarctic species and ecosystem protection and the interaction with other international regimes. Catherine?
Thank you very much, and especially to Professor Shibata for putting the panel together. So yes, as mentioned, I am both a law professor and I've been on the IUCN delegations now, in fact led some of them, but now to 3 ATCMs and only 1 CAMLR. So compared with some of you in the room, I'm still a student at these politics and practical, but also I've had a lot more insight into some of the negotiations behind the scenes and what states want to come and talk to us about than a normal academic. So these comments are certainly completely personal, not for IUCN, but they are, I guess, informed by some of my participation in that way. So I've got what I think is like an eclectic mix. I've made them into a few bullet points of points that I want to make. And I'm going to start with the state of the Antarctic environment. That state and the prognoses or predictions for its current ecosystems and species is much worse than most people think. Climate change has already reached Antarctica. The seas are already immeasurably warming and acidifying. The ice is already melting and breaking up. And species that depend on that ice, the ice obligates, they are already declining, and we all know the stories about the emperor penguin chicks and the molting adults that have fallen through melting ice and drowned, for example. The food chain is already changing. Prey species are moving. We've got a lot of, particularly birds, and include the penguins in there, that are having to go further to find food. Albatross chicks in the New Zealand subantarctic islands are declining rapidly, and I think I gather part of it is they're not getting food, and then when they are, they're being given plastic to eat. So there's a number which fits in with the previous speaker. Non-native species are increasing rapidly, plants, animals, and diseases, and we've already heard about the avian influenza, but I thought that would be a really good example that the primary cause of the vulnerability red listing for the southern elephant seals is avian flu, that HPAI killed more than 90% of its chicks in the recent season across the continent. Some colonies lost 97%, with also fewer adult chicks breeding than previously because they were sick. So we've got 97% of chicks lost to a smaller number of breeders. That has made them vulnerable to extinction, and now forgive me if I forget the precise time frame. I think this might have been within 3 generations. I know that's also, though, the emperor penguin one within 3 generations, and that put them on a higher category. So forgive me for not getting the right number, but vulnerable to extinction, technically triggering the threshold within the annex to species designation, if parties were so minded to use that designation. As we've heard, the climate workshop stressed that we aren't making decisions as fast as the changes are happening. Some say the decision process itself is not fast, let alone the political will to make things happen. And so some species are facing extinction before 2100 on these current projections. For many Antarctic and Southern Ocean species, we don't actually have the data to even conduct the red listings, the red listing vulnerability assessments. So that makes things hard. Right. So that's the end of the first doom and gloom point. But on the bright side, the IUCN red list process has responded to climate vulnerability. The actual listing process didn't used to incorporate climate change because it was considered uncertain enough on how it interacted with species. Now there's more information. Now those predictions, the climate predictions, are being incorporated into the vulnerability assessments, which has resulted in some of those changes that we've heard about. I do note that IUCN would love to conduct many more Antarctic and Southern Ocean species assessments and the new Red List of Ecosystem assessments where they're assessing tipping points. So if anyone has access to those who really want to help conduct those, whether it's philanthropic donations or states and their programs, just let me know and we'll put you in touch with the right people. I do also have a positive transparency comment relevant to the red listing process. Some previous species assessments had not been able to access up-to-date data that was held by CAMLR. That has been fixed. As a result of this interaction purely around that, we made an assessment of 2 species that then the UK complained about because they didn't use up-to-date data because our scientists hadn't been able to access it. So now it's like if states fear vulnerability assessments saying something's going to go extinct and they don't want that, they'd better give us the data. And there was a joint workshop held between IUCN, SCA, and hosted by CAMLR, hosted by Chile earlier this year, that assessed 300 species of marine bony fishes, or more, I think it was 320. So there is a commitment to provide much more data and to work together in the space, which is a real positive progress point for transparency. So for my 4th and 5th short points, I'm going to very briefly say 2 things about BBNJ. Which is one of these potentially overlapping regimes, maybe not, depends on whose view you look at. This is first just a question from someone I have not been a BBNJ scholar. I've been reading materials about it and hearing discussions. I wonder if the concept of stewardship in the BBNJ preamble might be elaborated on in the future. I don't know its drafting history. I know it started off being proposed in an article and then got moved to a preamble. How might that be thought of? What were states thinking about when they put in stewardship? How might that be relevant to how states conceive of their responsibilities? Could we move that over to Antarctica? Could we think of the same? So I think that there's just a question I leave. I was also very interested in Karen Scott's presentation of her research on the parties' statements about BBNJ versus the Antarctic Treaty System, including in their domestic incorporations. When this has come up in meetings in the ATCM, I think and CAMLR last, maybe it was 24, maybe 25, I can't remember exactly, the parties to the Antarctic Treaty System were very clear that BBNJ didn't apply, and I think it was UK that proposed that working paper that made a statement about it. And so this will be extremely relevant to legitimacy, I think, in the eyes of the rest of the world, the public, of the ATS and how they're handling marine protected areas in particular, the protection more generally. So I've only got 3 more little bullet points. So geoengineering is going to be of huge relevance. The proposals for geoengineering in Antarctica that I've seen have completely ignored any effects on Antarctic ecosystems. They've treated ice, sea ice and ice shelves in particular, as though it's some irrelevant blob of inert material, not as the basis for the Antarctic food web and the ecosystems. There will be huge overlaps between geoengineering and the protection of Antarctic flora and fauna coming up much sooner than we think, and there is worry that some of them might not be controlled by states. So that's something we need to keep a real eye on for protection of Antarctic ecosystems and species. So another point, I think there's also an overlap with the environmental rights movement, as we have already has already been raised. Many IUCN members passed a resolution at our Democratic Congress last year calling for an evaluation of the concept of rights and how that might look in respect of Antarctica and how that would be implemented. I'm lucky enough to be leading one of those evaluations. This is an interesting overlap, and I think it's one that needs to be handled very carefully, cross-culturally, and taking account of the many Antarctic Treaty consultative parties that are also IUCN members, which includes Russia and China, and now not the USA at the moment, but that might be temporary, we don't know. The final point to mention, I think, is the Antarctic intrinsic value that is mentioned very strongly in the protocol. It's mentioned as a core fundamental value, and the protection of intrinsic value of Antarctica has also listed as a fundamental consideration that has to be taken into account in respect of all activities undertaken in Antarctica. So that's non-governmental, governmental, everything. ASOC brought a great information paper to ATCM 48 with more work yet to come. It's still ongoing on this. There's a number of academics, myself included, who've also done a lot of work on intrinsic value, and we want to now bring this to bear on the Antarctic Treaty System. What the work emphasizes to me is that it's not our rights to Antarctica, it's not state rights to Antarctica, but we have to be looking at the responsibilities to the common heritage. And I like the way we say common heritage of humankind. Intrinsic value says it's not ours, right? It's not just ours, it's inherent to these other species. So all of these overlaps make me wonder whether we can see a return to that deeply philosophical environmental protective values of the time around when the Antarctic Treaty was drafted. The deep ecology was on the rise, the anti-modernity of the Rachel Carson Silent Spring movement, that was the late 50s. That was that era. Might we get another Earth Day that came out of that? Can this compete against the neoliberalism and greed that's taking off around the world? I certainly hope so. I would hate that overlap of neoliberalism, selfishness and greed to override that Antarctic exceptionalism. I loved Patrick Flamm's comment. He so rightly said we need to encourage that more. And exceptionalism could mean let's ignore the geopolitics that are happening elsewhere and let's try and do more amongst ourselves. So yeah, no more than in environmental protection, which common heritage and part of the web of life. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you very much. You raised a lot of very interesting points, but to summarize, I will say that despite the Antarctic Treaty System is still a state-centric regime, international organizations, NGO, have a very important role to play in Antarctic governance, and you have just show the important role that you all are doing. So thank you for that. So now we will move to our next speaker, Dr. Ville Kari from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Ville will discuss environmental liability in the Antarctic and what scholars could do next. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. And thank you, Catherine. After these forward-looking bombs, it's good to go back to a topic that has been with us for several decades and to go to our own unfinished business. So I want to thank Professor Shibata and PCRC and the JSPS and all the other organizers here in Japan for this wonderful opportunity in this panel, and the ATCM. And as you heard, I want to talk to you about a topic about what what can legal researchers do to help realize environmental liability in the Antarctic. Now, it's a topic that we always come up with. I want to very briefly recap the basics. In the shortest and briefest terms, environmental liability means this. If you cause harm to nature in the Antarctic, you're obliged to clean it up. And if someone else has to come and clean up after you, then you will be held liable to compensate for the expenses of that cleanup. That's sort of the gist of it. Domestic laws establish environmental liability in many maritime areas nearby the territories of those states, but Antarctica is one of those areas where you need a special international regime to make it effective, partly because environmental damage in Antarctica occurs in the Antarctic, which isn't on anyone's home turf. Let's not get into any disarguments about that, but yeah, that's the principle. To fix all this, Annex 6 on the Environmental Protocol of the Antarctic Treaty was adopted in 2005. It took many years to negotiate. It was very, very carefully crafted. All the states then, as consultative parties, they agreed to it. It provides for an international legal liability framework for environmental emergencies, so major events. We're talking about oil spills or similar gigantic disasters that we don't want to see happening, and even less do we want to see them sort of unattended for. But as you know, there have been hurdles. The implementation of those provisions that were agreed, that's lagging behind on the domestic level. And this has delayed the entry into force of the whole liability network of a mechanism. And it also holds back the next steps, which is to build a more comprehensive liability framework. And so in order to keep on working, pushing it forward towards the realization, I want to propose a 5-point plan. And my suggestion is that scholars could work on these 5 points in parallel instead of waiting for one after the other. So the first point, of course, is to contribute to the implementation of our Annex 6 on the domestic level. There are still 9 countries to go who still need to implement it before it enters into force. What we need to do is we must go to our national environmental authorities and civil servants and find the people who are responsible for carrying out the legislative preparation for the implementation of Annex 6 at the domestic level. This means that to the Antarctic Environment Protection Act, you need to add a couple of articles saying that liability annex applies, and then just send a letter to the depository saying, we've done it. We need to ask them, how can I help you? What can I do for you? Can I prepare the first draft? Who are involved? Can I put you in touch with people who've done this in other countries? So that needs to be done. I've got good news. In 2024, Professor Shibata and Dr. Shin invited experts, officials, and academics together in Kobe to exchange views on the implementation in Japan, Korea, China, and India. And at this year's ATCM 48, Japan informed the meeting that its implementation of Annex 6 was imminent, that is IP 97. So Japan is about to complete the implementation. Also, the other countries mentioned there who were here, they're in Kobe, they also gave signs of progress, that things are actually happening. So there's genuine possibility for impact there. But we can go beyond the implementation. So essentially, in short, everybody can do work like Regina just presented. We should do exactly what she's doing. So the Annex 6 contains more than just the basic provisions. It still requires work to be completed, towards completion. Article 9.4 of Annex 6, it says that the meeting shall review the limits of liability every 3 years. So there's one question, is what are the proper limits of liability? Article 7.5 of the Annex gives the ATCM the right to make binding decisions on liability. And should this ever come to pass, it would be very interesting to know what the procedure should be and how that should be done. Any disagreements about liability issues supposedly may end up in arbitration under the Environment Protocol or dispute settlement system under those provisions. That's again something that people might want to look into. Finally, as we heard from Regina, Annex 6 provides for establishing a liability fund. under the administration of the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat. How would this fund work, and how would disbursements be done, and all of these questions? We don't know anything of that. There's something that researchers could help with. The next step, the third level here, is going beyond environmental emergencies. So let us recall that Article 16 of the Environmental Protocol itself from 1992 clearly states that the parties undertake to elaborate rules and procedures on liability, and those rules and procedures shall be included in one or more annexes. So the environmental emergencies that we're talking about in Annex 6, those are just the first step. There's supposed to be a more general framework. Again, more work for researchers to contribute to. Fourth step, beyond Antarctic Treaty System. Now, this is a controversial one in this room, but the Antarctic environmental liability regime is receiving competition. So in 23, International Maritime Organization and the Comité Maritime International announced draft plans to expand certain IMO, sort of general maritime conventions, to also cover the Southern Oceans and Antarctic region. This is not problem-free because their limits and principles of liability, they differ from what has been established in Annex 6, but in order to nudge the parties forward, researchers might have a look at these competitors. Fifth, the final step for legal researchers would be the question of liability beyond Antarctica. So very soon we realize that there are similar issues being discussed with respect to the deep seabed, outer space, and so on. Clearly what we're dealing with here is part of a broader global process. So to recap, 1, proactive work on the implementations. Go to the people. Nils, you go home to Belgium, my good friend, and you find the people and put them in touch with Sonja's people who have done that, and all the researchers that we have here, and Professor Shibata's students, and then people get to work to it. Completing Annex 6, so looking into those things that we know should be there, but we don't know what they contain. 3, move on towards the general environmental liability, start talking about that in the meetings, and we'll see how small the implementation becomes. 4, look at the competitors, bring in some pressure, seeing that, well, there are others who might try to do this if the Antarctic Treaty System doesn't do it. And 5, remember that there's an entire planetary scale behind this, and that's also something where we can contribute because we have already a fairly sophisticated situation here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those recommendations that probably go beyond scholars. And Katie, maybe you can also think about all these, yes? So thank you for that. And now we will move to our final speaker, Ceicha Poirot, General Manager for Policy and Environment at Antarctica, New Zealand, and Chair of the CEP. Ceicha will reflect on the performance of the CEP over 35 years of the environmental protocol to the Antarctic Treaty. Ceicha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to put a timer on because I do tend to waffle. Yeah, cool. Well, I guess in thinking about this, the first thing to remind ourselves was that the protocol came out of the CAMLR negotiations, and so it was a lot of work had gone on to sort of think about the Minerals Convention, but between 1989 and 1991 the protocol was agreed and adopted, and it was only 7 years later that it entered into force into 1998. And I think if we tried to negotiate the protocol today, we probably wouldn't get there. So I think that's a celebration in and of itself, 35 years later, that we still have this instrument, and it's working for the most part, from what I've heard over the last 2 days. And when the protocol was agreed, it has these annexes that provide further information, and they were sort of written in a way, and I think we might forget this piece, but that you can update them. And so that was really good and flexible thinking at the time. I think it was relatively simple too, so some of the core provisions designating Antarctica and its dependent and associated ecosystems as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. Tick, that's pretty cool. The prohibition on mining and mineral resource activity. Tick, that's pretty cool. It requires environmental impacts to be a fundamental consideration in the planning and conduct of activities, so the EIA process. Tick, it's working. Contingency planning and environmental emergencies, maybe not so good given what we just heard. And of course, the establishment of the Committee for Environmental Protection. And I do recall when the protocol celebrated its 25th anniversary, previous chairs got together and we had this online sort of celebration. And Tony, you were there, and I'm going to give you credit for this. But I remember one of the takeaways from that celebration at the time was that the committee's kind of gone through 3 phases. So the first phase was, establishing itself and working out how it was going to work and its behavioral norms. And then it moved into the second phase of establishing its procedures and building its handbook. So, actually coming up with its guidance and information to sort of implement the protocol and its annexes. And I think now the committee is in a new phase, and we've got a lot of global change, so climate change, emerging issues such as microplastics, geoengineering, wildlife, disease and pathogens, amongst others. We've got geopolitics, and we've got, I'm going to throw in here, technology and data. And so we're in this kind of phase now, and I think that's where we're still trying to find our way, and this is where the comments where the pace of decision making is slow. But first of all, looking back over the successes, as I said, the committee celebrated its 25th anniversary, and there is a publication that sort of outlines some of the successes over the time, which is on the Antarctic Treaty website. It's a little bit hard to find, but go to the environmental portal piece and there's a link. And 10 years on, IP59 sort of talks about what we've done since then. So there's a good bit of information that sort of highlights some of the successes. From my perspective, the committee has managed to meet every year, with the exception of 1 year due to COVID. In that time, each of those meetings, we have adopted a report and formulated our advice and given it to the ATCM. All of that work of the committee has resulted in possibly, maybe this is a broad statement, but the majority, or at least more than 40% of the agreements through the ATCM over that time, through measures, decisions, and resolutions. The committee's grown in its membership, so originally 26 signatories, and now there are 42 members. It's developed its tools, so there is a comprehensive sort of CEP handbook. Again, all of that information is available on the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat's website. We've got established ways of working, and we've heard about that as well. So we've got intersessional contact groups for both formal, informal, and established subsidiary groups to progress our work throughout the intersessional period. I think we had the comment earlier that many of the regular tasks of the committee are being completed. ASPAs are being reviewed, ASMAs are being reviewed. We're continuing to develop the protected area system with new protected areas. We're updating and reviewing our visitor site guidelines, creating new guidance and reviewing it as required. I think the committee is also taking more of a strategic approach in developing a 5-year work plan and reviewing it and updating our agenda, and now looking at a process to look at our science and information needs. And Sonja also said, which I think we talk about in the CEP, that we operate very collaboratively, professionally. We call ourselves a family, and it's actually a good meeting to come and attend. So I think those are all successes of the committee, but those successes aren't without limitations. And so my own reflections on some of these is, the first thing is around resourcing. Most committee members, I don't think the CEP work is their full-time job, and they kind of do it alongside a lot of their other work. And so resourcing, which includes to me people, time, and money, and it really relies on individuals. I think engagement, a lot of the work is done by a few, and there is that institutional memory, and so how do we get greater engagement? And as a person who speaks English as a first language, and I don't speak any other languages, I think that might be one of the factors that if we could broaden how we work, particularly using the 4 languages, might be another way to garner more engagement. Of course, we've heard lots about the geopolitics, and I still have my positive pants on. I think we're a technical advisory body, and that while politics is playing out there for the large part, it hasn't quite got there yet, but I think we're starting to see that in this phase. I think as activities in Antarctica grow and the diversification of those activities, we are sort of, again, trying to work out how our tools can address some of these things. Noting when the protocol was agreed and the annexes were put in place that we could review them, the committee or the treaty parties have only actually updated the annexes once, as far as I can remember, and they were very, very minor, like 1 or 2 wording changes. So are we flexible enough to be able to sort of look at our tools and update them? And that's possibly not an idea that is readily going to be suggested by any member. And how do those annexes deal with emerging issues like diversification of activities or geoengineering? Technology, a lot of the stuff we do in Antarctica is geospatial, and so we've heard from WMO about data management and how do we access that stuff when we actually haven't got any finances behind us, and nor does the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat sometimes get given the mandate or empowered to manage that stuff, and also the limitations of information being entered into the exchange of information. And the emerging sort of technology around remote sensing and how can we use that better. And then also just basically a couple of other things is just around like the implementation of the protocol and its annexes. And you know, we've got some really strong measures agreed through the ATCM which still aren't in force, as well as Annex 6 amongst others. So these are some limitations. And I'm over time, so good thing I put my timer on. In regards to where do I see the next steps and whether or not the committee can deal with some of these limitations or how we approach that third phase, I think we have a clear mandate. It's in the protocol, and I'm still very positive about that. And I think we are talking about some of the current contemporary issues that we can't find agreement on in violet areas, especially protected species designation, but that's not the first time we've disagreed on topics. The difference I find is that we've been able to find a way forward when we disagreed, and now what we're sort of seeing is an inability to find a way forward where everybody can agree enough to agree. And I will also say I really resonated with Patrick's comments around Antarctic exceptionalism. We need to stay invested and preserve the institution because it is good, and we probably wouldn't be able to agree something like that. But can we be flexible to the change in this new phase that we find ourselves in? And the question is if the Antarctic treaty system can keep pace, given the pace of environmental change and the external factors impacting Antarctica. So I think if we could take the precautionary approach, the next 5 to 10 years will be really interesting to watch, and we'll see where we end up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ceicha. That was very, very good, and not only because you review what the CEP have done in the last couple of years, but also moving forward what we need to do to strengthen the system. So now I would like to thanks all the speakers for those excellent presentations. And first, before we open the floor, I would like to start by inviting any of the speakers to briefly react to each other's interventions, or maybe to pick up on common themes that stood out. So I don't know if someone has any comments or would like to. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bruno. Catherine, you mentioned geoengineering, that it's coming, and we've heard in the previous panels how it's very useful to have concrete examples about something that's going on. Do you have anything in particular in your mind that you could share with us as to what we might be looking forward to?
So the one example that I was thinking of that like pretended that Antarctic ice, like there was no ecosystem to be even concerned about, was the one that talks about an ice curtain. Talks about a curtain to put down in front of it. I mean, and a lot of people are nodding. You just look and go, it's like WTF. right? But just the way it's described and the lack of, environmental impact assessment. The impact assessments are a lot of them are only looking at what it might do to carbon emissions or to heat or to whatever that one thing it's targeting. It's not an interactive bit. And the other thing I would like to point to is an article that came out late 2025, I can't remember exactly when, but it was the second half of the year, I believe, SIEGERT, SIEGERT, et al., lots of authors, excellent review and a comment including on environmental impact assessments and those kinds of things in there. I think that at the moment is state-of-the-art article that all of the geoengineering proposers are having to address and and defend their proposals in light of. So that is, if anyone's interested, is to find that article to be looking at what people will be talking about. I think those are two short things. I talked too long before, so I'm going to try and be real short.
No, that's all right. Thank you. And I still have some questions. Oh, yeah, Nils.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. And I also wanted to pick up on one of the points that Catherine made about Antarctic exceptionalism and its role. And I think what I've seen from my 5 years in CEP is that just the people engaged in the Antarctic discussions are very much worried about the Antarctic and care about the Antarctic. And it's just looking forward to how we're going to manage environmental protection, our achievements, also our challenges. I think this dedication from the people engaged in the discussions, that gives me quite a bit of hope that we might actually, if these people keep pushing also at home, which is probably the most difficult thing to do then, but I think that gives me a lot of hope that we might actually, this Antarctic exceptionalism, this family that we have, which was something Nengye mentioned earlier, it is really a family, and it's really a family of people who really care deeply about the Antarctic, and so it makes me hopeful.
Thank you for that very positive comment. And now let's open the floor to questions from the audience. And so please feel free to direct your question to specific speakers or to the panel as a whole, but keep in mind, especially ACR, that there is a book at stake for the best question. So now is the last chance. So, okay, I'll start with you. Yep.
Thank you very much. I will very much value this opportunity, and I have questions to Nils and Ceicha again. And I want to know, from your experience, we know that in 2023, the Helsinki Declaration, the mitigation goal, like the zero emission goal, has been committed by the parties, like politically agreed. So why does that discussion is not continuing in the CEP, and could that be brought up again and put up back to the table again? What's your opinion or view on this? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. Tricky answer. Well, in the sense, tricky and simple answer in the sense that there's a political side, there's a political answer to that question. It's trickier to talk about climate change nowadays due to the views of some around the table. But some of those also appropriately point to the fact that, let me take a step back. There is a question of to what extent can we, and someone picked it up, I can't remember who, to what extent can we in the Antarctic treaty system actually act on that issue? I think we're very much focused in the SC-CAMLR on climate change response, focusing on the impacts of climate change in the Antarctic. And so just to say that that's really the focus of the work we've been doing. But I would have to look up the recommendation again, but there is a recommendation coming out of the workshop that says we should communicate about the impacts on Antarctica from climate change and the need to do everything also at home to, I can't remember how it's exactly phrased, so please don't quote me on this, but there's a general recommendation that we communicate about the impacts of climate change to our public, and that might help also to reinforce those commitments to zero emissions in general, not only in Antarctic operations, but more generally. Do you want to add something there?
I can talk from a national program perspective. Decarbonizing activities in Antarctica is, I think, currently impossible, subject to a couple of people who have managed to solve that, but planes and ships, there's no alternative at this point in time, and the use of batteries is still developing, so it's currently not possible. And so while we can measure our emissions and put in lots of alternative like wind farms and solar panels and things, it's not going to be able to get us to carbon zero at this point in time. That's not to say in the near future that might not be possible. So I think that's partly why it's stalled.
Thank you. If there is no other question, or I want to ask you a question to the whole panel, and because we have mentioned Antarctic exceptionalism several times, and that it's good to protect the Antarctic Treaty System, but also we have been discussing about the BBNJ Treaty, the Plastic Treaty. So my question for the whole panel is, how does this regime interaction may affect this Antarctic sui generis regime, in the sense that my question is, to what extent should these international regimes outside the Antarctic Treaty System should regulate, let's say, the protection of the Antarctic environment or the adoption of MPAs, or should the countries that are Antarctica the best be the one that do all those things? So should we open the game and say, all right, let's discuss whether or not MPA should be discussed at the BBNJ conference, or CAMLR should be the one adopted MPAs under the ATS for the Southern Ocean? So I wonder what you think.
My first thought in relation to that is, we initially had this idea that Antarctic was exceptional. It was, you know, like that product of Cold War, but it was outside the bounds of the petty politics, and we had something higher to aspire to. And I think we've actually diminished that, and hence the call from Patrick this morning that we need to go back to that. So maybe, so if what happens outside, which may be making further progress, say, like BB&J, because it wasn't requiring consensus, but if there are other movements outside that affect ATS, maybe it would get back to it, that exception, you know what I mean? I know it gets back to its original idea of exceptionalism, even if it's becoming more similar to the others. So it's like big picture and meaning of words and that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Thank you. I have mixed views on the idea of Antarctic exceptionalism. I certainly can see its value in the context of privileging those core values within the Antarctic Treaty System, and certainly the efforts until relatively recently of being able to isolate decision-making in the Antarctic from sort of broader geopolitical concerns, and there's no doubt that the Antarctic regime has been successful in that respect. But I think it does obfuscate from the idea that actually, you know, the Antarctic regime is still very much a product of international law. It's a product of those kind of post-World War II politics. It is a product of the colonial era. It also implies a sort of a physical separation, which I don't think is appropriate from a climate, from an oceans point of view. And I struggle with it, particularly in the context of climate change, because I don't think it's helpful to sort of exclude, you know, substantive consideration of kind of climate and what states are doing in relation to climate, you know, from the impact of those activities on the Antarctic. So I think it's a double-edged sword. And I would certainly say in relation to the BBNJ agreement, I think there's potential real value of working kind of collaboratively with that regime and potentially other regimes, which is not to say that where it's appropriate to do things in the Antarctic, that they shouldn't be done in the Antarctic. But I'm not comfortable with an exceptionalism which is equated with exclusion. And I think that is happened more recently, and that I think is problematic.
At the risk of sounding a bit scholarly, I would like to share that I think what we have, especially between the Antarctic Treaty System and the BBNJ, is a very classic example of a regime collision in the sense that the ILC report on the fragmentation of international law expressed it. I think the Antarctic Treaty regime is doing exactly what it's supposed to do when it presents itself as a self-referential regime that is isolated, because it is sui generis and it is such a unique and quite well-defined regime. That doesn't mean that people who are involved in the Antarctic Treaty regime cannot understand that what's happening in Antarctica doesn't stay in Antarctica and vice versa. So, for example, in climate negotiations, Turkey is going to the COP and they're going to present the Antarctic concerns there. That's what you do in a cross-regime situation. You advance the interests of your regime by co-opting the language of the other regime. You don't have to say that because we are representing the Antarctic Treaty System. Rather, the people who might be in these circles, when they find themselves in other circles, they may use the vernacular legal language in those regimes to function in ways that are beneficial to the Antarctic Treaty System. I think that's how competent, conscious lawyers and diplomats work. Where it becomes challenging is when in the future there shall be a dispute between the regimes. So if you think about marine protected areas and there's something that comes under dispute, then the question arises, which forum does it belong to or belong in? So who decides who decides? And that's where it's going to end up in the sort of hot spot of regime collisions. I have no idea what to think of that. This is beyond my expertise, but I just wanted to share that this is a very familiar situation that we are in. Thank you.
Okay, I think that we are running out of time. We have time for one last question. I don't know if any ACR wants to win this book. This is the right time to do the question. If not, I will thank again the panel for your excellent presentations, and I think that we can all join me and thank you. And so thank you all again, and I think that we should stay here because we will have our last panel right next to this one. So thank you all, yes, and stay here in the auditorium. Yeah, thank you.
それでは最後のセッションを始めたいと思います。南極条約のガバナンスを語ると、どうしても英語中心になってしまっていて、それは実はATCM の会議の中でも4カ国の公用語ではありますけれども、例えばコンタクトグループなど正式な会議の中ではない中で、しかし重要な交渉をしているような場は全部英語で行われます。そういう中で、本日と、昨日は日本でこの会議、このコンフェレンスを開 拾わせていただいているということもありまして、日英の同時通訳を入れさせていただきました。はい。で、それをすることによって、私の期待としては、日本のボイスもここに反映できたらなと思っております。ですので、この最後のセッションはもう完全に皆さんから質問ないしはコメントをいただく会にしたいとは思っておりますけど、最初にちょっとここにいらっしゃる日本の方々で、この2日間いらっしゃってですね、ここは聞いてみたいとか、これだけ言っておきたいとかいうことがありましたら、ぜひそれを言っていただいて、でその後また英語に中心になっていくと思いますので、もし何かありましたらぜひこの場でご意見をないしは質問をお願いしたいと思いますが、いかがでしょうか。一つあります。ありがとうございます。他どうでしょうか。はい、スチューデントから学生さんからもありますね。ありがとうございます。新聞社の方もいらっしゃいますけど、よろしいですか。ありがとうございます。研究者もいらっしゃいますけれども、ぜひ聞いてくださいね。はい。それでは、はい、三橋さん、彼女は大変南極にご関心がある、未来館という、博物館のからで働いておられる方でありまして、はい、今回もこの会議に参加していただいておりました。はい、じゃあ三橋さん、ぜひ質問ないしはコメントありがとうございます。
はい、ただいまご紹介いただいた三橋です。昨日今日と興味深いお話を聞かせていただきありがとうございました。登壇された皆さんに改めてお礼を申し上げたいと思います。で、柴田先生からご紹介いただきましたが、私今日ちょっとプライベートで参加しているんですけれども、未来館、英語で正しく言うと、おそらく多分通訳の方も知らないと思うので自分で言いますと、The National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation というのが私の勤め先の正式名称です。帰国される際に東京に寄られる方はぜひお台場にあるので遊びに来てください。で、今回お話を伺っていて、社会や市民に対してどうアプローチしていくか、パブリックエンゲージメントだったり教育のお話がたくさんあったんですけれども、今回皆さん特に触れられてなかったんですけど、私が勤めているような科学館だったりとかで、私の勤め先ではサイエンスコミュニケーターという科学と社会をつなぐっていうところを専門にしている職員もいるんですね。で、そういった人たちが何かこういった場で役割を果たすことができるんじゃないかなと思っていて、その部分を皆さんに少しご意見を伺えたらなと思ってます。で、私たち何もやってないわけではなくって、昨年の夏もちょっとアイスコアを取り上げてみたりとか、今年の夏も大南極展という特別展をやったりしているので、そういった意味ではサイエンスの方ではかなり中心に活動ができているんですけれども、こういった ATCM みたいなののガバナンスの方に関してはやっぱり難しいところがあって、皆さんの意見を聞きたいなと思っています。で、あともう一つすごい答えにくいと思うんですけれども、皆さんが私が勤めているような科学館の職員で今回のペンギンについて小学生の子どもから聞かれたら、皆さんだったら何て答えるのかなっていうところの意見も聞けたらなと思っています。はい、よろしくお願いします。
ありがとうございます。お答えいただく前に、もう一方、はい、手が挙がってますのでよろしくお願いいたします。
はい、本日はこのような貴重な機会にお招きいただきありがとうございます。そしてこれを企画していただいた柴田先生と、今回、トランスレート、翻訳していただいた翻訳家の方にも心から感謝申し上げたいと思います。で、私からは質問というよりかはコメントなんですけども、今回2日間このイベントに参加させていただいて、南極地域と聞くとどこか特別な地域だとか、その環境面、シビアな環境だったりセンシティブな 環境っていうものが注目されがちだなというふうに感じてたんですけども、その中にも共通点、環境問題だったりの影響がすごく、環境問題に対してすごく脆弱な環境であるっていうことは南極地域以外にも言えることだし、そういった共通点などもあるんだなということもあって、この地域っていうものを特別視するんではなくて、共通点っていうものを見出していくことが今後の何か新たな問題に対して取り組むきっかけになるのではないかなというふうなことを感じておりました。はい、僕からのコメントは以上です。ありがとうございました。
はい、ありがとうございました。あくまでもお二人の意見ではありますけれども、はい、Voices of Japan、Voices of Japanese ということで、ぜひこれからの最後の議論の中で取り上げていただければと思います。So I'll go back to the to English. So if any of the chairs or even the audience might have some answers or comments, additional comments on those two voices from the local. One is the public engagement and how this governance, Antarctic governance, can be communicated more effectively to youngsters, for example, elementary school children, for example. I think that was one. And the other one was more of the how this exceptionalities of Antarctica can be can find a commonalities amongst the parties who are trying to govern this very exceptional place on the earth. I think that was the kind of comments that we have had. Okay, Tony has one. Thank you.
I might try and answer both questions and at the same time. I think Japan does its public exhibition of Antarctic science very well. I think Korea does. And I think both countries actually do it a little better than Australia does. That doesn't mean it's perfect at all, but everything that I've seen of your public engagement in Antarctic issues, in exhibitions at your national institutions, has been excellent. And last year I was involved in a conference in Tokyo about collaboration in Antarctic science, and the associated exhibitions that went with that were just excellent. In terms of Antarctica and its interaction with the rest of the world, well, Antarctica is the engine room of global climate, and everything that happens in Antarctica affects the rest of the world, and we should be getting that message out there. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have Sanjay there. Any other comments or any additional comments or questions from the floor? Okay, so Bruno, thank you.
Thank you for both questions. And first, I would like to clarify something that Tony has said, because if you go to Hobart, there is an entire floor in the museum dedicated to Antarctica, the same in Adelaide. And if you go to other countries such as Argentina, Chile, even I think New Zealand has an entire floor in Christchurch, the Christchurch Museum dedicated, Karen Scott saying yes. So there are exhibitions, usually in countries that are closer to Antarctica. So that's probably that is related, obviously, that those countries are also claimant states. They want to show the strong link that they have with Antarctica, but there are lessons that we can learn from those countries. So the challenge is how we can translate what those countries are doing into the global north, probably. Yeah. And then regarding the second question, I wanted to say that it's interesting because we have to keep in mind that the Antarctic Treaty System was developed by the states active in Antarctica, so the Antarctic community, to address regional problems. So the Antarctic Treaty System is not going to solve all world's problems. Yeah, climate change is a global issue. The Antarctic Treaty System has a role to play, but I think that Bill mentioned this morning or yesterday. The Antarctic Treaty System is about science, peace, and the protection of the Antarctic environment. There are other forums where we can go to discuss climate change. The Antarctic Treaty System may inform those other regimes what to do. Obviously, there are lessons that we can learn from other regimes. There are lessons that they can learn from the Antarctic Treaty System. But we have to keep in mind that the aim and objective of the treaty system is peace, security, and the protection of the Antarctic environment and its associated ecosystems. So there is a challenge there, and it's about the aim and object of the entire treaty system. Thank you.
Bill, thank you. Please, please.
On the Museum Science Center perspective, museums and centers seem to do an excellent job at science, history. If you're able to come up with a way to convey politics without putting a diplomat behind the glass wall, that would be fabulous. I know we have some academics here who are very interested in that social science aspect, and that is a very tricky aspect to try to convey not only what it is or where it is that we're trying to protect or act, but that actual political process. And at this stage, I think that political process can be just as entertaining and challenging and informative as understanding that there's multiple types of penguins active in Antarctica. And there's even penguins outside of Antarctica. These are things you have to explain at times. So in order to even get to that political aspect. So I encourage you to continue to engage on this. I'm really, really pleased that you are here and asking that question. Thanks.
So we go to the floor. We have two hands up. So Sanjay first and Fumika next, and we'll take it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Also, thanks for this opportunity. Very sincere thanks to Professor Shibata. The kind of question I'm making a reference to, the second question, can only come from Japan, and let me say why. If Hiroshima is the city of peace, then the city of peace is embedded in a country of harmony. There is something called views from Antarctica, and there is something called views on Antarctica. And one of the wonderful things about the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings has been that it has been traveling from all over the world. And that reminds us of ikigai, that reminds us of flow. And if we were to look at Antarctica from Japan, then this question becomes very important. What is exceptional and what is commonalities? Then I think the view from Japan is a philosophical view. It is oneness. The Antarctic exceptionalism, as very rightly was pointed out, is not about insulation or exclusion. It is about engagement. E also stands for engagement. And what I want to do is to really appreciate the Japanese perspective on Antarctica, which can be related to Shintoism. And in Shintoism, you have oneness, if I'm not mistaken, which is the fundamental understanding that humans, natures, and the divine are not separate. It is Shintoism that brings us very close to something which was invoked at the Kochi Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, which was a Sanskrit shloka from Vedanta, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that world is one family. So that is what I wanted to really respond to, in response to the second question, that Antarctica today, in the era of the Anthropocene, also then forces us to look at it not just geopolitically, not just from the technocratic lens of governance, but also from a philosophical, ethical lens. As a matter of fact, the moment we deploy this philosophical, ethical lens and look at all these traditions of oneness, which I think are there all over the world, and particularly I made a reference to Shintoism in Japan, I think we get a very different perspective of what is it that we owe to Antarctica and to nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Fumika, could you, have your comments in a shorter version, maybe? Thank you.
Yes, I will try. So, hello, I'm Fumika Iwama, and I'm a PhD student at Kobe University. And I will try to make it short about continuing discussion on language and outreach, especially from the local engagement after hearing some voices of Japan. And I am a Japanese student, and I'm coming here as Japanese in a way, but I don't think I can represent my commonness of Japan because I understand English, and I had chance to have education in English, and that's rare for Japanese. But I think it's problematic for some people like me who can understand this kind of discussion. So it can be it was mentioned about hierarchy, but hierarchy of knowledge can be in discussion as well. So, and I think this is the difficult point of public engagement. So, and being in the media is a great step, but still, in order to actually engage more people, I think language is another issue, another big issue. So I want to ask panelists in the floor again. So it can be other than Antarctica, but if there's any kind of good practice of expanding outreach of social science, not natural science, and for knowing the good practice. So yeah. Maybe after the session is also fine, but yeah, I just wondered that. Thank you.
May I say something?
I think we have to end. Thank you very much. This again, thank you very much for all the engagement. And I think Makiel and somebody also mentioned about this concept of a trail that we started on May 10th, seminar just before the ATCM, and having the ATCM and some of us get together here with the outsiders and having this symposium right after the ATCM. And actually, before going to Incheon next year, some of us are meeting again in Kobe. So there is going to be another more academic discussions in Kobe on 26th. So I'm glad to have this kind of a trail with a different audience and different focuses, and somehow maybe in the probably you have seen this Antarctic governance white paper series. Maybe we might be able to reflect some of the outcomes from those trail into those white paper series. Hopefully, or maybe more elaborate special issue of the journals. But anyway, we try to reflect this in-depth thinking so that we can actually give some information outside. Most likely in English, but also hopefully in Japanese also, that the public will be able to access those information that we've been discussing here. So that's Kobe in between, but we are going to Incheon next year. And can I have final words from Yuncho, how we can expect towards next year? Thank you.
A party holding and hosting an ATCM doesn't happen that often. Maybe it happens once per generation. Last ATCM in Korea was 1995, so it's going to be 32 years after the first one. And it's going to 49, so maybe we'll use it as a prelude to the golden anniversary 50th. And so we know we are facing lots of challenges now. The old habit, excessive harvest, careless management. Also, we have potential collision with new emerging schemes and institutions, and new threats, plastics and other things. So maybe one ATCM will not save the whole ATS, but we will find a way forward. And it's not going to be striking a deal in one particular aspect, but if we somehow find ways to better resolve the difficulties, then it's going to be a success. When I go back home, I will speak with my colleagues, especially from government, and we'll determine our priorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for engaging with us. Thank you very much. And now you have the announcement, huh?
No, one more consultation.
Okay, so they have to consult for the, okay.
What is it? Is it about?
The book, yes. I think so.
Meow meow, come and get it. And thanks very much